My name is Natalie Nugent. Okay, I am the executive director of the Junction Arts Center. We're recognized as the Agricultural Center of Minnesota and supported by Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs and their immigrant support program. We would like to take this moment as we deepen our understanding of our history and our knowledge of the land of Ireland and our ancestry, that we do a land acknowledgement for the land that our center is on, and that it is on the Anishinaabe and Dakota land. Now tonight, we are coming to you from a new place. We are in the Celtic Junction Arts Center classroom. It's a new, beautiful space that's right across from our cultural library. It is recently completed due to a very generous gift from Mr. Thomas Redshaw. And it was dedicated this coming spring to his mother, Elizabeth Dillon Redshaw, during our 7th annual Arts Week, and very appropriately, in advance of our inaugural Irish Collective. Tonight, we are very honored to be presenting the seminar in partnership with the University of St. Thomas and the Center for Irish Studies program. It is my pleasure to introduce a special guest. He is an Erasmus Scholar visiting from the University of Miskolc, Hungary. He is a professor of English, specialist in Scottish studies. My pleasure to welcome Dr. Attila Dosa.
Good evening. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to deliver my lecture at the Junction Cultural Center. And I owe gratitude to Natalie, the Executive Director of the Celtic Junction, for kindly hosting this lecture. And I'm grateful to Professor Christine Wemmer, Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of St. Thomas, for negotiating my Erasmus visit between the University of St. Thomas and my home institution, the University of Miskolc. And I'm incalculably indebted to Dr. David Gardiner, Director of the Center for Irish Studies at the University of St. Thomas, who sadely can't be here tonight. But I'd like to express my thanks for his hospitality, for dealing with all the practical requirements that such an intercontinental visit can entail, and above all, for asking me to give this presentation, because composing this lecture has led me to take a fresh look at the poetry of Seamus Heaney. So today's topic is going to be the worker who reads the hermeneutics of class in Seamus Heaney and his contemporaries. Can you go to the next slide, please? I come from the University of Miskolc, which you can see in the central image, from Hungary. And Hungary shares a border with Ukraine, where war is raging at this moment. The 24th of February was a day of darkness for us in that corner of Europe, first and foremost for the people of the Ukraine, of course, but we in the neighboring countries, in Poland, in Slovakia, Hungary, and so on, have also been greatly affected. We are afraid that the conflict will spill over the border, and we are worried for the safety of our families and our homes, because it's a region full of history and culture. For instance, I can see this 14th century medieval castle, which you can see at the bottom of this slide from my bedroom window. And the surrounding hills are now dressed in the same stunning fall colors as here in picturesque Minnesota. And we'd be very sad to see all this destroyed. Now, allow me to preface my lecture by saying that I've been fortunate to speak recently at some of the distinguished universities in Europe, such as Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz, Germany, Charles University in Prague, Czech Republic, and the University of Warsaw in Poland. But I'm sure that I will consider the present event as the highlight of my academic career because of what this Irish Institute and the people who run it represent to me, that perseverance can take you far in life, but no matter how far you get, you should always remember your roots. My presentation is titled The Worker Who Reads. I chose this topic for two reasons. First, my research focus is on Scottish literature, but the work of Seamus Heaney never ceases to excite me. Not only because of its captivating imagery and unique sound effects, but also because he never forgot the humble background he came from, even when he was lunching with dignitaries or accepting the Nobel Prize at the Swedish Academy. Secondly, I also come from humble beginnings. My father had worked as a miner since he was 16, and my mother had worked in what we jokingly called the bread factory. It was a 10-story bakery that provided French bread for the table of tens of thousands every morning. And my brother had worked in the steel works since he was 18 and was one of the 30,000 workers laid off during the hectic years of transformation from socialism to market capitalism. Knowing firsthand that a pen is lighter than a spade, I chose it. I looked forward to the prospect of becoming one day a teacher, and I was admitted to a state university. But then my ambitions grew, and I got a scholarship to Oxford University, and then another scholarship for a PhD at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. And there was a time when I became painfully aware of the rift that university education caused between me and my parents. But I can tell you, I'm still very good at answering words, and at the end of the day, I'm still a worker who reads, nothing more and nothing less. So let me dedicate this lecture to the memory of my parents and my brothers. Can we go to the next slide, please? Seamus Heaney is widely considered the foremost Irish poet since W.B. Yeats. And in this lecture, I'm going to discuss his roots in a family of Irish field workers and how all that shaped his approach to poetry and how the political dimensions of his poetry mesh with notions of rural ordinariness. And I will point to parallels with his fellow poets from other regions in the British Isles. One is Tony Harrison, on the right-hand side, from the north of England, who, like Heaney, has been intensely concerned with his humble origins. And the other, on the left-hand side, is Douglas Dunn from the west of Scotland, who also rose through education without for a moment abandoning his roots. The work of previous generations as something to follow or live up to is a theme that all these poets revisit. They all share a devotion to the sweet yoke of poetry and pay their respects not only to their muse, but also to their parents in equally as eloquent a manner. Heaney came from a farming community, but never severed his ties with his Irish homeland. Even as he grew into a poet of global stature, he was committed to the literatures of various nations, from the United States to Poland. The Irish and the Poles, and the Hungarians for that matter, have shared a sense of exile, emigration, and political oppression as central to their identity. I will devote, therefore, the final part of my discussion to the enduring responsibility to his people Heaney shared with his Polish contemporaries, arguing that his international perspective strengthened his loyalty to his country, his people, and his family. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. Seamus Heaney was born on a farm called Mossbaum in County Derry. This is not that far. This is just for us to have an idea what it could look like. Into a family of 9 children. In his Nobel Prize lecture, he remembered life on Mossbaum as, I quote, an intimate, physical, creaturely existence. His early poems depict the slow and precise life his parental home, and he knew well that it was necessary for him to engage with his foundational experience before it disappeared with the mask of time. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is perhaps best seen in the short sequence called Mossbarn. Its first poem, Sunlight, evokes the family home, filled with a sense of security and warmth. I suggest that we listen to the poem in Heaney's reading.
Mossbarn, Sunlight. There was a sunlit absence. The helmeted pump in the yard heated its iron. Water honeyed in the slung bucket. And the sun stood like a griddle cooling against the wall of each long afternoon. So, her hand scuffled over the bakeboard. The reddening stove sent its plaque of heat against her, where she stood in a flowery apron by the window. Now she dusts the board with a goose's wing, now sits, broad-lapped, with whitened nails and measling shins. Here is a space again, the scone rising to the tick of 2 clocks. And here is love, like a tinsmith scoop, sunk past its gleam in the meal bin.
Thank you. Heaney dedicated this sequence to his aunt Mary. In his memoirs, he remembered her as, I quote, the affectionate center, the heart of the house. In the closing lines of the poem, he captured an image of her as a timeless, humble monument to domestic affection as she bakes bread for the family. Can we go to the next slide, please? The seed cutter describes the calendar customs of agricultural work as opposed to domestic work. In this poem, Heaney celebrates neighborly work as the sustaining force of an existence lived almost outside of time. The rhythmic cycle of work that holds the community together is so ancient that the 16th century Dutch painter Peter Bruegel might have turned it into a bucolic painting. And here you can see the painting I'm referring to. With time to kill, they are taking their time. These timeless moments and spaces of agricultural work have the potential to re-sacralize the world, as one of Heaney's critics has said. Indeed, it would be a mistake to think of the family farm as anything other than a line of salvation thrown into Heaney's way. The family home, the flowery kitchen table of Heaney's aunt at its center, occupies a time zone entirely distinct from the historical strife that afflicts the larger community beyond the boundaries of local topography. Next slide. Now, it's been noted that Heaney's early poems negotiate a relationship between his origins in rural Northern Ireland. But as Bernard O'Donoghue, Irish poet and one of the most eloquent critics of his generation, reminds us, I quote, this rural poetry was by no means an uncontaminated idyll. Now let me take the opening poem in Death of a Naturalist, Heaney's first complete collection, to illustrate this. It's the poem entitled Digging, and to this day, it's one of his best known poems. I suggest that we evoke the poem again in his words.
Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. Under my window, a clean rasping sound when the spade sinks into gravelly ground. My father digging.
I look down till his straining rump among the flower beds bends low, comes up 20 years away, stooping in rhythm through potato drills where he was digging.
The coarse boot nestled on the lug. The shaft against the inside knee was levered firmly. He rooted out tall tops, buried the bright edge deep, to scatter new potatoes that we picked, loving their cool hardness in our hands.
By God, the old man could handle a spade, just like his old man. My grandfather cut more turf in a day than any other man on Toner's bog.
Once I carried him milk in a bottle, corked sloppily with paper. He straightened up to drink it, then fell to right away, nicking and slicing neatly, heaving sods over his shoulder, going down and down for the good turf, digging. The cold smell of potato mould, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge through living roots awaken in my head. But I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it.
Thank you. The poem, I think, rests on the linking of the work of 3 generations. Immersed in his own calling to put new lines on the page, Heaney looks out the window and sees his father turning soil. The single image of the working parent reminds him of bringing milk to his grandfather, worked in the bogs, cutting peat. Now, if you come from that background and then get translated from it into the area where you are working at poetry, there's something in your primal being that needs to justify to yourself, Heaney said in an interview. I think this self-justification may be the force that could upset the pastoral for some readers. For when his father's skills remind him of his grandfather's lifelong expertise, and he says he has no spade to follow them, one is tempted to read this statement as a renunciation of the parental craft, or maybe as an expression of some guilt for not carrying on farm work. But please note that Heaney says he has no spade. He never says he has no skill, or spirit, or resilience. What I see here is continuity rather than conflict, because he will follow them. Only his skills will feed into a professional his choice, teaching English, writing poetry, and exploring the history of the community. Next slide, please. The poem called Follower is often discussed along with digging. I suggest that we listen to Seamus Heaney again.
My father worked with a horse plough. His shoulders globed like a full sail strung between the shafts and the furrow. The horses strained at his clicking tongue. An expert, he would set the wing and fit the bright steel-pointed sock. The sod rolled over without breaking. At the head rig, with a single pluck of reins, the sweating team turned round and back into the land. His eye narrowed and angled at the ground, mapping the furrow exactly. I stumbled in his hobnailed wake, fell sometimes on the polished sod. Sometimes he rode me on his back, dipping and rising to his plod. I wanted to grow up and plough, to close one eye, stiffen my arm. All I ever did was follow in his broad shadow round the farm. I was a nuisance, tripping, falling, yapping always. But today, it is my father who keeps stumbling behind me and will not go away.
Thank you. The poem again revives this admirable piece of craft that Heaney associates with his father. But this time the focus is on his father's accuracy in controlling the horses and keeping the furrows straight. The wheel has come full circle as Heaney recounts how the memory of his once expert father now stumbles behind him, just as he stumbled behind his father as a boy. The poem has a subtle structure, and it's this almost invisible skill that makes it even more amazing. There's a perfect symmetry in the poem. The first 3 stanzas recall the father's accuracy. However, the last 3 stanzas focus on the awkward boy, with each stanza beginning with the word I. There's a mirror effect between the 2 halves. In the first, the 4 rhymes reflect the father's neat work, but in the second, Heaney uses imperfect rhymes to, and these awkward word pairs reflect the boy's inability to measure his father. The run-on lines he uses in the first part reflect the effortless turning of the plow at the end of each furrow, while the boy stumbling in his father's wake is stored in end-stop lines in the second half. It's only in the last stanza, which provides an image of the father now stumbling along behind the adult poet, does the run-on line reappear. And I sense here a touching gesture of respect for rather than impatience with the memory of the father. For even when the father has the awkward gait of old age, he is evoked in a way as if it were still the easy sailing when the wind caught the sleeve of his shirt in the field. And yet, there is this ending that keeps bothering us as we read and reread the poem. But today, it's my father who keeps stumbling behind me and will not go away. Northern Irish artist Noah Connor illustrated this poem for the poetry collection Rarities, published in 1979. First edition is held in the O'Shaughnessy Library Special Collection, which I had the privilege to view yesterday. The illustration in this book shows a large bird with outstretched wings, and Neil Corcoran, the Irish critic, believes that this provides a counterpoint to Heaney's sense of being constricted by familiar entanglements. I'm curious what you think of the ending of the poem, but my reading is that the father's memory haunting the poet's imagination is just another example of how he polishes and preserves the last seed of filial love he holds onto against the passage of time. It may be that we cannot keep the memory of all we remember pristine and pure, but we'd be sorry if all these echoes and images of the past, whether personal or historical, were to fly away in the wind. Teaching at the University of California, Berkeley, and looking back on his native tradition in Ireland from a distance of 5,000 miles, Heaney realized that, I quote, poetry was a force, almost a mode of power, certainly a mode of resistance. And I suggest he poured that force into a sequence of 6 autobiographical poems called Sailing School. Can we move, please, to the next one? The first poem in the series is entitled The Ministry of Fear. In this poem, he looks back not only to Ireland, but also to his own school days. Heaney contrasts memories of the strange and often violent formal education he received in Londonderry with those of his informal trespassing into the cultivated garden of English poetry. He first made these attempts to write poetry in English in secret solidarity with other classmates, such as the now famous poet Seamus Heaney, and out of respect for already established parental figures such as Patrick Kavanagh, who is referenced in the first line. Now, some critics and even poet friends of Heaney have read the poem as indicative of his ambition to occupy the English poetic tradition, but this reading may not do full justice to the complexity of his approach. For the poem does many things at once. It's a declaration of his contradictory heritage, Irish and English, educational and simple origins, but also it's a response to it and an attempt to correct it. However, this attempt takes place within the tradition and discourse that was already appropriated by the cultivated classes. And perhaps this is why the poem expresses a sense of inferiority and awkwardness, similar to the poems about his father. Please note the word hobnail in the following lines. I tried to write about the sycamores and innovated a South Derry rhyme with hush and lulled full chimes for push and pulled. these hobnail boots from beyond the mountain were walking by God all over the fine laws of elocution. But whereas in the poem Follower, the simple footwear gave his father extra support, for Heaney, it's now an obstruction, constraint, sign of stigmatization. It suggests how out of place he felt in the sophisticated realm of English poetry, as if he were trespassing on the grounds of an elegant country house. But also note how proud he is of the changes he has introduced in the rhetoric of English poetry. It's now time to move on to discussion of Heaney's poetry in the context of his contemporaries. Please, the next slide. Thank you. Born the son of a baker in the working class district of Leeds, Tony Harrison attended Leeds Grammar School and Leeds University, where he won a scholarship in classics and linguistics. Like Heaney, he benefited from the Butler Education Act, which provided scholarships for young pupils of working class origin. Heaney came from a rural background, more suited to constructions of a bucolic haven, and it was the different rhetorical sensibilities of Ireland and England that he had to contend with as he developed his own voice. But when Harrison, who comes from a radically different urban context, infuses the working class idiom into his poems, the impression is of a cubist noise rather than richness of flavor. However, filial love always overrides the uncomfortable sense of social difference in his poetry too. An ironic but epiphanic episode he fondly recalls is indeed behind the inspiration for his poem called the Rhubarbarians. This is a portmanteau word which is pulled together from rhubarb and barbarians. Remembering a walk he took with his father near the rhubarb fields outside Leeds, he recalls the childhood word for rhubarb, tusky, which he knew from the local dialect. His father had told him that 98% of British rhubarb came from Leeds, which reminded his father that he was once in a school performance of Julius Caesar as one of the spear carriers, an unimportant period. He said they were taught at school to make indescribable crowd noises by saying rhubarb, rhubarb, rhubarb. And it leads Harrison to imagine the Luddites, his textile workers, on the barricades, saying rhubarb, rhubarb. That is, because the local word for rhubarb is tusky, they are imagined as saying tusky, tusky. Of course, it's but imagination, for the language of the mob is no more than indescribable noises, like the spear carriers in a Shakespeare play, and the exact words are not recorded in history or in plays. The irony within the irony is that Harrison will make poetry out of these indescribable noises. On the right of this slide, you will see the fortified house of Mr. William Horsford with a wall with firing slits. And it was his mill that some of these Luddites actually tried to attack in one particular instance of uprising. Can we move on, please? Even in a single poem like the Ballad of Babel Labor, this is also a portmanteau word, Babel and labor, it's impossible to decipher in a few minutes his complex references to language. Let me just suggest that Harrison dramatizes the contrast between the ancient Sprache, timelessly defined as the language of the masters who make history and who write history, and the ancient grunts of the workers, more clearly than anywhere else in his poetry. What Sprache did the labor speak? This is the question. Whatever name's carved on those stones, it's not the one who labors. Whether we see the collapse of language into dialects, sociolects, and slangs as a divine punishment, the Tower of Babel, or as the product of a self-serving economic conspiracy by the powerful, Harrison, like Heaney, concludes that a compensatory reparative poetry is necessary. Anything that is not RP, anything that is not accepted language becomes acceptable for the poet. The uncouth speech of the workers becomes as much the raw material of poetry as the high culture whose knowledge Harrison, as a worker who reads, is surely steeped in. I brought images of two paintings that the poem refers to. I don't know if it's a coincidence that the painting at the bottom is by the same Bruegel that Heaney refers to in his poem, The Seed Cutters. But the most important visual clue is the German word in Gothic script in the first line of the poem. This visual and linguistic Germanism, together with the epigraph, which is in the middle at the bottom, from the German poet Bertolt Brecht, and the indication that the poem begins with a question, usefully recalls Brecht's poem called Question from a Worker Who Reads. And this is the next slide, please. It's tiny print. Let me just read one or two lines, please. This is the way it begins. Who built thieves of the seven gates? In the box, you will find the names of kings. Did the kings hold up the lumps of rock? Now, you remember the picture of the castle that I showed you near where I live. Outside the castle, there's a memorial plaque of King Louis the Great, who had the castle built. No memorial plaque with the names, the workers who actually built it, of course. Now, you may have noticed that there's a word in the title of my lecture that I still owe you to clarify. And I think now is the time to do so. It's hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is a method of understanding that involves finding the meaning of a text by asking the right question to which the text provides an answer. In the broad sense of the term, I believe that especially in education, asking the right question is perhaps more important than finding the right answer. Now, there's a very clear analogy between Brecht and Harrison in that both are concerned with questioning the texts and traditions that are not supposed to be questioned, at least not by ordinary people. At the basic level, the irony arises from the fact that these workers who read and ask questions, include themselves in a dialogue with history and thus open up new dimensions of meaning. The other contemporary of Heaney from the British Isles I wish to discuss is Douglas Dunn, and this should be the next slide, please. He's an eminent poet from Scotland. He also came from very poor circumstances, but then became a very distinguished scholar. He was nominated for the office of Professor of Poetry at Oxford University, and in 2014 he was awarded the Queen's Gold Medal for services to literature by Her Majesty the late Queen Elizabeth II. In 1979, Dunn published the book entitled Barbarians, the first half of which consists of a sequence of poems called Barbarian Pastorals. This is an oxymoron. Barbarians have always been considered as uncivilized people, while the pastoral is a genre of high literature that reflects on the rural as basically the playground of Aristophanes. Now, when I asked the poet in an interview for my book about what has come to be known as the work of the barbarian poets, the barbarian generation, Heaney, Harrison, and Donne, he told me the following, I quote, "I think I coined the term barbarians in a poetic context in the mid-1970s when I wrote the first part of my collection, Barbarians. Tony Harrison was in the same district of thought and feeling at the time, and Seamus Heaney also, perhaps even a little bit earlier. I use the term to mean the oppositional or socially and politically hostile aspect of contemporary poetic sensibility, which was shared chiefly by poets of working class and non-English origin in the British Isles." Can you move on, please? Thank you. The poem I would like to present to you today by Douglas Dunn is entitled The Student, and here's the poet himself in his office at St. Andrews University. Excuse me. As in the poetry of Heaney and Harrison, and indeed in all great poetry, I think, the personal and the public, history, memory come together in this poem. Coming from a working class background, he was born in Renfrewshire. His father worked in the local tire factory. And having been a beneficiary of the education like the other two poets, Donne himself is a Renfrewshire student. So this is the personal side. And as for history, the context of the poem can be placed in the Paisley Weavers' strike of 1812 and the subsequent riots of 1820. The Radical Rising or Radical War, also known as the Scottish Insurrection of 1820, is invoked at the beginning of the third stanza. In Paisley, when they read the Riot Act, we faced the horsemen of the 10th Hussars. Men's bones were broken, angry heads were cracked. This was the last armed uprising on Scottish soil with the aim of establishing a radical republic. The uprising was violently put down, and 3 leaders were executed in Glasgow and Stirling. This is also a worker who reads. He reads Tacitus at the Mechanics Literary Club. He says, "It takes all night of this rough country table which I struck before I see that it by candlelight spreading my boatside." In Glasgow in the 19th century, there was a dizzying number of nearly 200 literary clubs and societies. The majority of these societies were outside or independently of formal educational institutions to further the aspirations of workers at a time when the social class was just beginning to perceive itself as when the working class was just beginning to perceive itself as a social force. The students' literary self-study goes beyond a quest for improvement driven by intellectual curiosity, I suggest. The study of the classics is presented by Donne as an almost revolutionary act, a conspiracy against structures of state and economy. He wants to master Latin prose in order to learn to bend alien discourses to his own ends. He wants to engage with scholarship and culture to increase his chance of social mobility on a basic level. What good can come of study I must have? I read it once and I read it twice again. But on another level, he asks questions, much like the worker who reads, keeps asking questions in Greg's poem to challenge ideas about the relationship between social background and the rights to education. Am I deceived? Is literature a life proved much too good to have its place in our coarse neighborhoods? The dynamic in the poem arises from the tensions between the student's lower social status and his pursuit of higher education, and the fact that as a worker, he is not expected to study the classics. A very similar ideological struggle between registers takes place in the poem called Journey to Krakow by the Polish poet Zbigniew Herbert. This should be the next slide, please. I think it's appropriate to turn now briefly to Heaney's connections with Polish poetry before concluding my discussion. Seamus Heaney admired his American contemporaries and felt a bond in the United States with other expatriates from Europe, such as Joseph Brodsky of Russia, and especially Czesław Miłosz of Poland. Czesław Miłosz recognized Zbigniew Herbert, a kindred spirit, and translated his selected poems. Herbert died in 1998, and Heaney commemorated him in the poem called To the Shade of Zbigniew Herbert. I'm not going to read from the poem, but let's focus on Herbert himself. On the 10th anniversary of Herbert's death at the reading held by the Irish-Polish Society in Dublin, Heaney described Herbert as, I quote, a poet of historical importance for the Polish nation, as a poet of exemplary ethical and artistic integrity in world literature. And here's a poem, Journey to Krakow by Zbigniew Herbert. As soon as the train got going, the tall, dark light begins, and he speaks like this to the boy, with a book on his knees. You like to read, boy? I like it, replies the latter. It makes the time go by. Always plenty of work at home. Here, it doesn't bother people. Well, there, you're certainly right. What is it that you're reading? Peasants, replies the latter. Very true to life, only a little too long is the right name for the winter. I've also read The Fourth Wedding. That's actually a play. Very hard to follow, too many people. The Deluge is something else again. You read it, and it's like you've seen it. Really, he says. Great, almost as good as a movie. Hamlet, by a foreign writer, also very interesting. Only this Danish phrase is a bit too much of a sack. Hello, dark in the train. The conversation suddenly breaks off. The authoritative commentary says this. In the white margins, the prints of fingers and the soil are marked with rough thumbnail, fracture, and condemnation. Herbert's poem, I suggest, records a conversation with a peasant boy who judges classical works of literature with a certain degree of self-assurance, which the poet perhaps finds as pathetic as it is sympathetic. The poem concludes with the symbolic image of the boy's fingerprints on the pages of his book, same soil that Heaney kept returning to. This is my last one slide, please. To the question I posed to Douglas Dunn, is it necessary to define who the barbarians are? He replied this: barbarians are those who have otherwise been excluded from high culture, but who, by the later parts of the 20th century in the northwest European archipelago, this is the British Isles, you can't get more neutral, came to necessity, very much to the embarrassment of those who assume that they have inherited and own the language and its poetic possibilities. And he added, you seem to indicate a tension between high culture and the concerns of the people, and I would agree, he said. I want to be a poet of high culture, but at the same time, I don't want to be disloyal to my native parish, my home, and my most immediate people, children, friends. In sum, for Tony Harrison, expressing working class concerns in traditional verse forms is a way of testing the limit of his craft from a political, radical perspective. What Douglas Dunn uses his craft to highlight political complexities that a simple style or loose metrical structures would not have been able to capture. For Heaney, however, craft is what you learn from others, is the skill of making. He said, of course, craft mattered to Heaney, but it was a definition of his stance towards life, a definition of his own reality that was perhaps most important to him. Let me finish my presentation by suggesting that Seamus Heaney, of course, he was a very wise man, but he may have been wrong for just one thing. When he was elected professor of rhetoric and poetry at Harvard University in the United States, he was delighted, but he was also surprised that his work attracted the attention of the American public. He said, "Their noise isn't my noise. Their concerns aren't my concerns." This is what he said. And then he went on to discuss the differences between American poetry and European poetry. Now, there's a simple rule that literary critics of poetry should follow. And this is the following: Heaney is only right. And right he may have been about the themes towards which poetry in America, as opposed to Europe, gravitates. But he did not consider the passionate, impeccable, and enduring commitment that people like you in the audience and on the board of this remarkable institution can do. And at the Center for Irish Studies at the University of St. Thomas, are dedicated to the protection and nurturing of all things Irish, so that we can come together to commemorate, celebrate the works of Seamus Heaney. Thank you.
Would you like to ask anyone's questions?
Yes, please. Thank you for your attention. And would you like to ask some questions, please?
Well, I'm humbled by the lecture, and I'm very, very intrigued by all of the parallels and the connections, especially the honoring of the relationships and of the soil. And it didn't, I know the ending, as I suppose a lot of you guys relate to Heaney's poem, the squat pen rests within my hands. I'll dig with it. And yet it's really incredible to look at how that theme stitches through so many of these barbaric writers, as you say, that the terminology is really quite incredible. And are there others outside of that or within this contemporary work that would also include themselves as the barbarians within the literature or even within Hungarian literature?
I would say certainly, yes. Especially if we talk about, say, Scotland, there's a very strong sense of republicanism, the European sense of the word there, and radicalism, as opposed to monarchy. So I think you would find plenty of writers in Scotland, not just poets, but also novelists, writers of fiction. One would have to be, for instance, James Kellerman, who actually writes novels in what we sometimes demeaningly call dialect. That's the language of the people, of course. And this is not a new thing, because of course Walter Scott, in the early 19th century, he used the Scots in his novels. But know the difference, because he always used the dialect in quotation marks, in dialogues, quoted. But these writers, like James Callan, actually write the whole book, in this speech form, not just the dialogues, but also the narrative parts. And going back to poetry, perhaps it should be, I think, the late Tom Leonard, who died, I think, 2 years ago at Christmas, who would be a very strong and very important candidate for this title. I don't know really why he's not usually included in this generation of so-called barbarian poets, but certainly he's also of working class origin, and he was educated at Glasgow University. He's also a worker who reads, and he also writes. He also wrote his poems, many of them, in the local dialect, in the Glaswegian speech, which is very difficult to understand, even for native speakers of English, not to people like me. In other countries, I think we just mentioned like this Polish poet. In Hungary, in my country, there's a very famous poet. You might have heard about him, called Attila Dosa. And he was also a working class poet, a modernist poet from the early 20th century. And he was a Marxist. He was also a Freudian, and he actually wrote a poem in which he says, "I haven't had it for 3 days. This is the beginning of the poem." And that's true, that was his life, basically. And when we had the change of regimes, the fall of communism and so on, in 1989, 1990, actually, there was a very strong danger of him, disappearing, from the curriculum because of his Marxism. But luckily, it didn't happen. Okay. So there's of course common sense, and we appreciate aesthetics, over politics. And I think that's very important, no matter where it comes from, high culture or people who are trying to inhabit high culture.
I have a question on that.
Yes, please.
Dear Professor, do you believe that a level of historical importance, like the mentioned poets have, can be achieved in our modern society by young poets of our times? In a society in which young people are slowly drifting away the real essence of literature, art in general, I'm worried that in a few years' time, poetry and literature will vanish from the minds of younger generations.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a very serious question, but I have to be ironic. Sorry. All these historical poets were young, but of course, they are significantly used, I think, at a point. Also, I'm not sure what is meant by the essence of literature, because I think the point of my talk was that, it might be different for anyone. It depends on where you come from, really. It depends on what language you inherited. It depends on what customs you inherited. But I think that might be important. Two things might be important, and I'm being partly serious and partly ironic. The serious part is, dedication, craft, resilience. Just like we heard and saw in the work of these writers. And the ironic part of my answer is that it takes critics. If critics believe that work is significant, that will probably last. And in fact, going back to Attili's question, why people like the ones I mentioned, such as Tom Leonard, are excluded from this barbarian generation, although they are very much part, in a sense, of this generation. because they were born in the same period, they had the same concerns, is because of criticism, because there were a bunch of critics who actually believed, that these, three poets look very similar, and why don't we discuss them together? So you're a young poet, okay, you want to express as well as you.
Embarrassingly, I always thought the phrase "to read someone riot act" was merely a quirky idiom. So now I know that there's historical significance. Wondering that maybe some of the younger generation might not know about the riot act, as do I. Now I want to dig into that.
You mean the one mentioned in Douglas Dunn's
I do.
last poem? Right. Okay. Yeah. I have to say, I've heard about that before, but I had to pick it up, from history, because this was like a long time ago, like 200 years ago, and this was the last violent act, on Scottish soil. Basically, as I said, they wanted to establish a radical republic. It wasn't a very big affair, though. But the uprising was put down, and there were special proceedings for treason. And we are talking about basically less than 100 people, who were among the insurgents and who were brought to trial. The charge of treason was actually brought against 88 people who were involved in the radical events, and 22 of them were brought to trial because most of them fled the country. I guess mostly to the United States and Canada. 19 of those 22 were transported to Australia, and the rest, 3, as I said, were executed in Glasgow in the story. Yes, please.
I have not so much a question, but kind of wanted to dig in a little bit to one of your statements and the title of your lecture tonight. When you said that hermeneutics, in hermeneutics, the questions that you ask in interpretation are more important than the answers in some ways. And to me, that relates to the accessibility of these words, of these poets, for people who are not from the high class, and for people who are laborers and rural people. And I was just wanted to dig into that a little bit and have you expand on how how you see that. To me it says accessibility. So to me it says that the laborer is not at a different, or the barbarian is not at a different level than the high class. I didn't know if you had anything more to say about that in the title, and how that brings accessibility for everybody into being able to ask good questions.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Very acute insight, because really, as I cut a little bit of my lecture to fit the time limit, I had to cut some explanations, and indeed it relates to those things that I cut. So hermeneutics, it's basically a strategy of understanding, literary criticism, but it goes back to, of course, biblical hermeneutics. It's a very old scholarship. But the basic idea is, I think, that there's a dialogue, right, between the reader and the writer, between the reader and the text. It's not just that we accept, a book as something essential, something, carved in stone, but we are entitled to ask questions. And we all have different questions. So maybe a work is open to different interpretations on the one hand. On the other hand, I think what was radically new when Hans Robert Jost, this German literary critic, who, by the way, published his major work on hermeneutics at the University of Minnesota Press. So we're running, full circle again. So his radical innovation, I think, was that he involved, the reader in the making of meaning, okay? Rather than just looking at the text, as it is, as a separate entity. Now, as you probably noticed, the title of my lecture was The Hermeneutic of Glass. Yeah, because, you can approach text from all sorts of angles, certainly. And of course, literary critics and students in higher education are supposed to access, texts and literature from various angles. They are entitled to do that because they have the institutional authority behind them. Doctoral degrees, titles of professorship, scholarships, and I'm speaking against myself. They have the specific knowledge. They are supposed to have the specific knowledge. But what if you don't have this institutional authorization? What if you don't have the specific knowledge? Should you be locked out, of enjoying? Yeah, and so So why shouldn't you? Why couldn't you just try to read whatever you like to, whatever you feel is useful to you or your further education or your mental well-being, and you will need to ask your own questions if you want to get close to the text. And of course, this could be poems, as I just.
There are just observations here. If I could share those, it might be a nice way to close it out. One says, I have the sense with Heaney that there wasn't the same sense of the two solitudes at work. For example, the working man and the writing man. As there has been a long history of writing done by amateurs, such as monks in monasteries and others who would have done labor work and intellectual work at the same time. I think Heaney sees expertly working a shovel, not any less of an art than writing a poem. It's a good observation. And then following on the discussion of younger folks and the future of poetry, a longtime friend of the Celtic Junction is observing that the music culture is filled with poetry, and that is a common area for contributions. Irish musician Hosier, lyrics by Bruce Springsteen, she mentions it here. It's a new way to observe traditions, even though they may not be recognized in the traditional sense. It's a good observation, I thought.
Thank you very much.